On a plain old Tuesday afternoon in Japan, a shopping mall was packed with families. Parents were pushing carts through the grocery aisles. Kids were grabbing snacks after school. It was a normal day, the kind of day nobody remembers on purpose. Then, in the space of about 90 minutes, part of that mall was gone. Not burned down, not knocked over by a storm. It blew apart. A taxi driver parked 2 streets away heard a bang so loud he ducked, then watched chunks of the outer wall fly off the building and crash onto the road. Witnesses said the wall just peeled away, like someone had ripped the skin off the building and left the bones showing. Here's the strange part. There was no storm that day. There was no fire before the blast. The only thing that happened right before it was the ground shaking harder than almost anyone alive in that town had ever felt. This is the story of the earthquake that hit Kumamoto, Japan, on July 28, 2026. In one single afternoon, it snapped a factory chimney clean in half, dropped part of a bridge into a river, knocked out power to tens of thousands of homes, and derailed a freight train. And somehow, the strangest mystery of the whole disaster is still that mall. How does shaking ground make a building explode from the inside? Stick with me, because the answer is stranger than you would guess, and it is coming up. The afternoon Kumamoto broke. It was 4:27 in the afternoon. Kumamoto is a region on the southern Japanese island of Kyushu, home to castles, farmland, and a few big cities. Most people were still at work or just getting off school. Then the ground started to move, and it did not stop for a long, long time. Japan has its own way of measuring how strong an earthquake feels where you're standing. Scientists everywhere use something called magnitude to measure the raw power of a quake deep underground, kind of like measuring how big an explosion is at its source. This one came in at magnitude 7.1, which puts it in the same weight class as some of the worst quakes in modern history. But Japan also has a second scale, one that measures how violently the ground actually shakes on the surface where people live. That scale runs from 0 to 7. 0 means you would not even notice it. 7 is the maximum. It means the shaking is so strong that people cannot stay on their feet, and objects fly across rooms on their own. Kumamoto City and the towns around it hit that 7. The last time any place in Japan felt that same maximum level was back in 2024, in a different part of the country. That alone tells you how rare and how violent this was. Think about the last time you felt a big truck rumble past your house and shake the windows a little. Now stretch that feeling out, except it is the entire ground under your feet, and it does not stop after 2 seconds. It keeps going and getting stronger. That is closer to what people in Kumamoto felt that afternoon. Japan's shaking scale actually breaks things down into smaller levels too, and 2 of those levels help explain just how different this quake felt depending on where you stood. In towns like Amakusa and Ashikita, people felt what officials call Class 3 shaking, strong enough that standing up straight becomes genuinely difficult, like trying to stay balanced on a rocking boat. Furniture there tipped right over. But in Kumamoto City itself, the shaking hit Class 4, 1 level stronger, and at that level, it is not about being wobbly anymore. People could not walk at all. The only way to move was to get down and crawl, the same way you might crawl if the floor of a bus suddenly tilted sideways while it was speeding down the highway. There was also a strange, slower kind of shaking that showed up on top of the sharp, violent jolt. Scientists call it long-period ground motion, but here's the simple version. Tall buildings do not just shake fast and stop. They can also sway slowly back and forth, almost like a tree swaying in a strong wind, and that sway can actually get worse the higher up you go inside the building. People working on high floors in Kumamoto that day described feeling seasick, like they were standing on a boat deck instead of solid concrete, long after the sharp shaking below them had already eased off. One man, 74 years old, was pushing his shopping cart toward the checkout line at a supermarket a few blocks from the mall. He said later that when the shaking started, he genuinely thought he was going to die right there in the store. Cans and boxes rained down from the shelves around him. He could not even take a step. He just froze and held on. A worker at a nursing home for elderly residents had an even scarier afternoon. She was sitting at her desk when the jolt hit, and it hit so hard she could not keep her balance sitting down. Around her, residents in wheelchairs tipped over. A staff member fell and got hurt. For a building full of people who already have trouble moving fast, those first 10 or 15 seconds of shaking were terrifying. And the ground did not just shake once and stop. It kept sending out smaller quakes right afterward, some of them still strong enough to knock things off shelves. Scientists call these aftershocks, and they are basically the earth settling back into place after the big jolt, the same way a stack of books wobbles for a second after you bump the table. Except in this case, the wobbling kept happening for hours, and it is still happening today. Here's a fact that surprises a lot of people about magnitude: the scale that measures how big a quake is deep underground. It does not go up in a straight line, it jumps. A magnitude 6 earthquake is not just a little weaker than a magnitude 7. It actually releases something like 30 times less energy. So a magnitude 7 quake, like the one that hit Kumamoto, is not just slightly bigger than the small tremors you might have felt before in your own life. It is closer to being hundreds or even thousands of times more powerful than the little rumbles most people write off as nothing. That is part of why this particular number, 7.1, made scientists and emergency officials sit up immediately the moment it came through. There was also a moment of real fear along the coast. Because the quake happened so close to the sea, Japan's weather agency put out a tsunami advisory, warning people near the water that a wave up to about 3 feet tall might be coming. For a country that remembers the massive tsunami of 2011 all too well, that kind of warning is never taken lightly. People near the coast moved to higher ground. In the end, no dangerous wave showed up, and the advisory was lifted within a few hours. But for those first tense minutes, nobody knew that yet. In the first hour or two, nobody watching the news and nobody living through it actually had the full picture. That is normal for any disaster this size, but it is worth understanding because it explains why the reports coming out that evening felt so scattered and confusing. Emergency phone lines were jammed with far more calls than anyone could answer at once. Local television stations were cutting between helicopter footage of one location and reporters standing outside another, trying to stitch together a single afternoon that was actually happening in a dozen different places at the same time. A number that gets reported as 3 deaths at 6 in the evening can easily double or triple by midnight. Not because anyone was lying earlier, but because rescue crews simply had not reached every damaged building yet. By early evening, the full picture was still nowhere close to clear. Reports of fires were coming in, reports of people trapped in buildings were coming in, and soon one report would stand out from all the rest, a call about an explosion at a shopping mall in a town called Kashima. Before we get to that, if this story has already given you chills, you might want to stick around because it only gets wilder from here. I dig into stories like this one and explain the real science behind them in plain, simple words. No boring jargon, no skipping the good parts. If that sounds like your kind of video, hitting subscribe means you will not miss the next one, and turning on notifications means you will be one of the first to know when we get an update on exactly what caused that explosion. Because as of right now, even the investigators are not fully sure. Now, here is where the story gets genuinely hard to believe. The mall that blew apart. The mall was called Aeon Mall Kumamoto, sitting in the town of Kashima. On a normal Tuesday afternoon, malls like this one are busy. This one had roughly 3,000 people inside when the ground started shaking. At first, the mall did what it was built to do. Japan has some of the strictest building rules on the planet, built specifically to survive earthquakes. Staff guided shoppers outside to the parking lot, and thousands of people made it out safely during the shaking itself. If the story had ended there, it would already be a lucky escape. But it did not end there. A little while after the main shaking, something else happened. People nearby heard a loud bang. Smoke started rising from part of the building. Then, according to officials, a section of the mall's second floor came down, and part of the outer wall was blown clean off, exposing the metal framework underneath, like the ribs of the building were showing through torn skin. Local news crews, rushing to the scene, described a chaotic mix of people. Shoppers who had already reached the parking lot stood frozen, staring back at the building they had just walked out of, unable to process what they were seeing. Parents scanned the crowd for their kids. Employees who had gone back inside briefly, maybe to grab a bag or check on a coworker, suddenly could not get back out the way they came in. Within minutes, the parking lot that had felt like a safe, boring place to wait out an earthquake turned into the front row of an entirely new emergency. So how does an earthquake blow up a mall that already survived the earthquake? Here is the piece investigators have been putting together. Big buildings like malls are full of gas lines, used for things like kitchens and food courts and restaurants. When a powerful quake twists and shakes a building, it can crack or snap those gas lines, even in a building that mostly holds its shape. Gas is invisible, and in enclosed spaces, it can build up fast without anyone noticing right away. All it takes after that is one spark, from a damaged electrical wire, a piece of equipment, anything, and that built-up gas can ignite all at once. Rescue workers on the scene later reported smelling gas near the site, which lines up with this explanation. Officials say a gas explosion is now considered the most likely cause, though the full investigation is still going on. In other words, the earthquake itself did not blow up the mall directly. It cracked something hidden inside the building, and that crack turned into a second disaster all on its own, minutes, or maybe longer, after the shaking had already calmed down. That is part of what makes this so unsettling. The danger did not end when the ground stopped moving. For some people, the real danger was only just beginning. Think about how fast that turn happened. One moment, mall staff were calmly guiding a crowd the size of a small town out into the parking lot, doing exactly the kind of drill they had probably practiced dozens of times before. The next moment, part of the building they had just walked out of was on fire and missing a wall. That gap between relief and horror lasted only minutes. Not everyone made it out before the explosion. Some workers were still inside, finishing up tasks or helping other people evacuate when the blast happened. In the hours and days since, rescue crews wearing heavy gear have been picking through the wreckage piece by piece, searching for anyone who might still be alive under the collapsed section. The mall's own operator confirmed that several workers died, others were badly hurt, and for a stretch of time a handful of people simply could not be accounted for at all. Japan's National Police Agency said that in the first confusing hours, as many as 20 to 30 mall employees could not be reached by phone. Picture the scale of that for a second. 20 to 30 people, co-workers, all missing at once, all somewhere inside a building that had just partly caved in and caught fire. Families waited by their phones. Co-workers waited outside the police tape, and rescue teams kept digging. Aerial footage from a news helicopter showed the damage from above 2 days later. Part of the mall's roofline looked crushed inward, like a giant had pressed a thumb down on one corner of it. Smoke could still be seen rising from parts of the structure well into the following day. The company that runs the mall held a press conference to explain what they knew so far. Their president stood in front of cameras and confirmed that several workers had died. One was in critical condition, a handful were still missing, and several more had been hospitalized with injuries. It is one thing to hear numbers like that on the news. It is another thing to picture an executive standing at a podium, reading out a list of his own employees, not knowing yet if all of them were going to be found alive. Outside the police tape, rescue crews worked in shifts around the clock, using search cameras that can snake through tiny gaps in rubble and trained dogs that can sniff out a person buried under concrete and steel that no human eye could see through. Heavy machinery lifted slabs of concrete one careful piece at a time because moving too fast, or moving the wrong piece first, can risk causing a second collapse right on top of the very people crews are trying to save. Every so often, the crews would call for total silence so they could listen for tapping or a voice or any sign of life underneath the wreckage. Those silent moments, with dozens of rescue workers standing frozen and straining to hear, might be the single most tense image to come out of this entire disaster. This single event, one gas leak inside one damaged building, ended up becoming the deadliest single spot in the entire disaster. More people died at that mall than almost anywhere else the earthquake touched. And it happened not because the ground opened up and swallowed the building, but because of something small and invisible that the shaking set loose inside walls nobody could see into. If you think that is the scariest part of this story, you might want to sit down for the next section, because the mall was not the only building that failed in a way nobody expected. The chimney, the fires, and the trapped while rescue crews were still working the mall. Another emergency was unfolding a short drive away, in a city called Yatsushiro, at a paper factory owned by a company called Nippon Paper Industries. Factories like this one often have very tall chimneys, sometimes over 100 feet high, used to release steam and exhaust from the manufacturing process. You have probably seen chimneys like this before, tall, thin, painted in stripes so airplanes can spot them. During the earthquake, one of these massive chimneys at the Yatsushiro plant simply snapped. Not cracked a little. Snapped, the way a dry stick snaps in half, except this stick weighed many tons and was over 100 feet tall. When it came down, it crashed directly onto nearby buildings inside the factory where workers were on shift. Several people were trapped in the wreckage right away. Police said a number of employees could not be reached at all in the first hours after it happened, and rescue crews spent the following days carefully clearing debris to reach them. Some workers were pulled out alive. Others, tragically, were not. Think about how strange that is. This chimney had probably stood there for decades, through wind and rain and who knows how many smaller quakes, without ever falling. Then one especially violent afternoon, it went down in seconds, and it became one of the deadliest single spots in the entire disaster, second only to the mall. And the damage did not stop at one mall and one factory. Across the wider region, the earthquake was quietly breaking things everywhere at once, like a long crack spreading through a windshield in every direction. In the city of Uki, a residential building caught fire, with flames and thick smoke visible from a news helicopter passing overhead in the evening light. Firefighters in that area said their phones would not stop ringing with emergency calls. Once the shaking started, call after call, faster than crews could keep up with, the way a phone line jams up during a big storm when everyone tries to call for help at the exact same time. A hospital in a nearby town called Hikawa found itself treating more than 50 patients within just a couple of hours of the quake, with the number climbing well past that as the evening went on. Picture an emergency room built to handle a normal Tuesday night, suddenly flooded with dozens of people all at once, cuts from broken glass, bruises from falls, older patients hurt when furniture tipped over on top of them. Doctors and nurses who had clocked in for an ordinary shift ended up working one of the busiest nights of their careers. In Yatsushiro, the same city as the paper factory, footage showed part of a bridge roadway had simply come apart, splitting where two sections used to connect smoothly, making it impossible for any car to safely cross. Bridges are supposed to flex a little during quakes. That is actually part of good earthquake design, but this one flexed too far and did not go back together right. A freight train operated by JR Freight Railway derailed and tipped over at a station in Yatsushiro. Thankfully, checks afterward focused on whether the driver had been hurt rather than dozens of passengers, since it was a cargo train and not a packed commuter one, but it is still a jarring image. A massive train knocked sideways by shaking ground. Power went out for roughly 48,000 households across Kumamoto Prefecture that first night, according to the regional electric company. Now stretch that outage into the days that followed, combined with cracked and broken water pipes across the region, and you start to understand why this disaster did not end when the shaking stopped. It kept creating new problems for days afterward. Here is one problem almost nobody thinks about after an earthquake: the weather. Kumamoto in late July is hot, with temperatures climbing into the low 90s. For people whose homes lost power and water at the same time, that heat becomes dangerous fast. No fans, no air conditioning, no clean running water in a heat wave is a recipe for heat exhaustion, especially for elderly residents and anyone already hurt. Health officials in the region actually issued heat warnings on top of the earthquake warnings, worried that the heat itself might end up adding to the number of people hurt or killed by the disaster. Even one of Japan's oldest and most famous landmarks in the region, Kumamoto Castle, took new damage in this quake. Part of its outer wall came loose and crumbled. Here is what makes that particularly painful. The castle had already been badly damaged in that 2016 quake we mentioned earlier, and workers had been slowly, carefully rebuilding it stone by stone ever since. A restoration project so massive it was not even expected to be finished until the year 2052. Think about that. A repair job that takes almost 40 years, undone a little more in a single afternoon. For a lot of local residents who had grown up watching the castle wrapped in scaffolding, slowly healing, seeing it crack again felt less like property damage and more like watching an old friend get hurt twice. There was one piece of good news buried in all of this, and it mattered more than almost anything else on the list. The region around Kumamoto is also home to 2 nuclear power stations, one called Genkai and one called Sendai. Whenever an earthquake this size hits Japan, checking on nearby nuclear plants is one of the very first things officials do, for obvious reasons, rooted in the country's own history. The power company running both plants confirmed that it found no unusual readings at either site, and that radiation levels around them had not changed at all. In the middle of a disaster full of bad news, that particular update was the kind of quiet relief that does not always make headlines but genuinely deserves to. Trains took a hit too, beyond just that one derailed freight train. The regional railway company running the area suspended every single line it operates, both its high-speed bullet trains and its regular local trains, until crews could inspect the tracks for damage. The nearby Aso Kumamoto Airport managed to reopen the very next day, but several airlines still canceled flights out of caution, not wanting to risk it while aftershocks kept rattling the region. And through all of this, one worry sat quietly in the background the entire time. Kumamoto is home to a cluster of semiconductor chip factories, including one belonging to TSMC, one of the biggest chip makers on the planet, the kind of company that helps build the tiny brains inside your phone, your laptop, and even modern cars. When the shaking hit, TSMC evacuated its workers to safety as a precaution and began checking its factory for damage. Other chip companies in the area did the same thing, pausing production lines and running safety inspections. It is a strange thing to think about in the middle of a disaster about collapsed buildings and trapped workers, but a big enough shake in this one small region can genuinely ripple outward into delays for gadgets sold on the other side of the world. So, by the end of that first day, the picture looked like this. A mall partly destroyed by an explosion, a chimney down on top of trapped factory workers, a bridge split apart, a train derailed, tens of thousands without power, a castle chipped once again, and underneath all of it, the quietly terrifying question that everyone in the region was now asking out loud. Why does this one small corner of Japan keep getting hit so hard? To understand that, we actually have to go back 10 years, and then go even deeper down into the ground itself. Why this corner of Japan keeps shaking? Here is something you might not know. Not every part of the world gets earthquakes, and the parts that do are not random. Earthquakes happen along specific lines under the ground called faults, which you can think of as giant cracks running through solid rock, sometimes for dozens of miles. Kumamoto happens to sit right on top of 2 connected faults, called the Hinagu Fault and the Futagawa Fault, which are both part of a much longer crack system running across the island. Here is a simple way to picture how a fault works, without picturing the earth itself. Just picture 2 slabs of concrete sitting side by side, pressed tightly against each other. Over years and years, forces deep underground slowly push and squeeze those slabs. They do not slide smoothly, though. They get stuck against each other, building up more and more pressure, the same way your fingers build up pressure when you press 2 rough pieces of sandpaper together and try to slide them. Eventually, the pressure gets so strong that the slabs suddenly slip all at once, releasing all that stored up energy in one violent burst. That burst is what we feel on the surface as an earthquake. This particular stretch of ground did something even more dramatic during this quake. Scientists studying the fault afterward found that a section of it, stretching more than 16 miles long, actually slid about 11 feet in one single movement. Picture a crack in the earth over 16 miles long, and then picture the ground on one side of that crack jumping 11 feet compared to the other side, all in the space of a few seconds. That is roughly the length of 2 cars parked end to end, except it is solid ground moving that far almost instantly. Zoom out even further and you will notice Japan as a whole gets hit by earthquakes far more often than most countries on Earth, and that is not bad luck either. The entire country sits along the edge of what people call the Ring of Fire, a massive loop that circles almost the entire Pacific Ocean, tracing the outline of where several of these giant rock slabs, the ones covering the whole surface of our planet, bump and grind against each other. Japan happens to sit at a spot where 4 of these giant slabs meet and push against one another at once. That is an unusually crowded intersection, geologically speaking, which is part of why the country records thousands of small earthquakes every single year, most too weak to even notice, and why the big, dangerous ones keep coming back. If any of this sounds familiar, it might be because Kumamoto has been through something like this before. Back in 2016, this exact same region was hit by a pair of strong earthquakes just 2 days apart, one around magnitude 7 and one slightly smaller. Together, those 2 quakes and the damage that followed ended up killing more than 250 people, making it one of the deadliest disasters in the region in recent memory. Bridges collapsed then too. A section of Kumamoto Castle came down then too. It was considered one of the worst quakes Kyushu had faced in decades. That 2016 disaster actually changed how Japan thought about earthquake safety going forward. Engineers studied exactly which kinds of buildings failed and which ones held up, and used that information to update construction rules even further, making newer buildings even better at flexing instead of cracking. In a strange way, the lessons learned from Kumamoto's last disaster likely helped save lives during this one, in buildings that were built or reinforced after 2016. It is a small, sad kind of silver lining, the idea that surviving one catastrophe can make you a little more ready for the next one, even if nobody wanted a next one at all. Now, in 2026, the same fault system has ruptured again, in almost the same place. That is not really a coincidence. Faults that have slipped once often build up pressure again over time and eventually slip again, sometimes years later, sometimes decades later. Kumamoto sits at the southern tip of something scientists call the median tectonic line, basically the longest and one of the most active fault systems in the entire country, stretching across a huge portion of Japan. Living along that line means living with the knowledge that another big shake is always somewhere down the road, even if nobody can say exactly when. That uncertainty is exactly why officials have been so cautious in the days since the quake. In a press briefing shortly after the disaster, a Japan Meteorological Agency official explained that because the quake was shallow and because so many aftershocks followed right behind it, people in the region needed to stay alert, especially over the following week, for the possibility of another quake just as strong as the first one. That is a genuinely unsettling thing to hear if your house is still standing but cracked, or if you are already sleeping in an emergency shelter with no power at home to go back to. This is also part of why Japan takes earthquake preparation more seriously than almost any country on Earth. Buildings are built with special flexible frameworks designed to bend rather than crack during shaking, kind of like how a reed in a pond bends with the wind instead of snapping like a dry twig. Schools run earthquake drills the same way some countries run fire drills, so the motion of ducking under a desk becomes automatic instead of something you have to think about while panicking. There is also a clever bit of science working quietly in the background of every quake like this one. When an earthquake starts, it actually sends out 2 different kinds of shock waves. The first kind travels fast but causes barely any shaking. The second kind travels a little slower, but it is the one that actually does the damage. Japan has thousands of sensors buried across the country that can detect that first harmless wave the instant it happens. And in the few seconds before the damaging wave arrives, the system fires off alerts straight to people's phones and televisions. It sounds small, a few seconds of warning, but that is genuinely enough time to duck under a table, turn off a stove, or stop a train before the real shaking hits. None of that makes an earthquake this powerful painless. But it is very likely part of the reason the death toll, as devastating as it already is, was not dramatically higher, especially compared to quakes of similar strength in countries with weaker building standards and no warning systems at all. Understanding the fault line explains why this happened here and why it could happen here again, but it does not explain what happens next for the thousands of people whose lives got turned upside down in one single afternoon. That part of the story is still being written right now, as rescue crews race against a clock that never stops ticking. The race against the clock. 2 days after the earthquake, rescue crews were still out there, working through the wreckage of the mall and the paper factory, hour after hour, in the same brutal summer heat that was already making things harder for survivors across the region. There is a grim but well-known idea among disaster rescue teams around the world, sometimes called the 72-hour window. It is the rough amount of time after a major disaster during which trapped survivors have the best chance of being found alive, based on things like access to air, water, and how long the human body can hold on without help. It is not an exact deadline. People have been pulled out alive well past that point before, but every hour that passes after it makes survival less and less likely. By Thursday, that window for this disaster was closing fast, and everyone involved knew it. Japan's government did not wait around. Thousands of military personnel, along with police and firefighters from across the country, were mobilized to help dig through the rubble at both the mall and the paper factory. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi addressed the country directly, saying that emergency crews were being told, in plain terms, that every single second mattered. She promised the government would keep coordinating closely with local officials to get victims out and get help to people who had lost their homes, their power, or their water. By Thursday, officials were reporting that at least 24 people had died, with the number expected to keep climbing as search teams cleared more of the wreckage and confirmed the identities of those who had not survived. More than 60 other people were being treated for injuries, some of them serious. Among those who lost their lives was a young foreign worker, a technical intern from Vietnam, killed when heavy equipment came down during the shaking at the factory where he worked. A quiet but devastating reminder that a disaster like this does not just affect one country's own citizens. It affects anyone who happens to be there when the ground decides to move. Meanwhile, the number of people simply unaccounted for kept shifting day to day, which is honestly normal in the first chaotic days after any major disaster. Phone lines get knocked out. People get separated from their families. Someone reported missing on day 1 sometimes turns up safe on day 2, having simply been unable to call anyone. Other times, sadly, the news is worse. That uncertainty, more than almost anything else, is what makes the days right after a big earthquake feel so unbearably tense for the families waiting for news. Away from the 2 main disaster sites, thousands of other people were living through a quieter, slower kind of hardship. Homes with cracked walls or broken pipes were declared unsafe to stay in, so entire families packed into local gyms, and community centers turned into emergency shelters overnight, sleeping on cardboard mats laid out in rows, waiting for word on when they might be allowed back into their own houses. For some of them, especially anyone who had also lived through the 2016 quake, this was not their first time doing this. It was their second, in the same lifetime, in the same town. Word of the disaster spread well beyond Japan's own borders, too. Foreign governments and international aid organizations began offering help within the first day, the way countries often do after a disaster this size, everything from rescue teams to supplies. It is a strange kind of comfort, knowing that even as one small region deals with a catastrophe up close, the rest of the world is watching and ready to lend a hand if it is needed. On top of the physical rescue effort, another quieter crisis was building in the background, the heat. With temperatures climbing into the low 90s and thousands of homes still without power or running water, health officials worried openly that heat exhaustion and dehydration could end up adding to the toll of this disaster almost as much as the earthquake itself did. Evacuation centers packed with displaced families had to be stocked with water, fans, and cooling supplies as fast as possible, all while rescue crews were also trying to keep themselves safe from the same heat while working 12-hour shifts in heavy protective gear. And then there is the ripple effect that reached far beyond Kumamoto itself. Remember those chip factories we talked about earlier? In the days after the quake, several of them remained paused for safety inspections, even after workers were confirmed safe. In a world where a huge share of the chips inside phones, laptops, and cars comes from just a handful of factories on this one island nation, even a short pause at one cluster of factories can send small shockwaves through prices and supply chains on the other side of the planet. Kumamoto ended up becoming a major chip-making hub for a simple reason. It already had skilled workers, reliable land, and good water supplies, all things chip factories need to run cleanly. Over the past few years, billions of dollars poured into building new factories there, turning a quiet farming region into a genuinely important piece of the global technology puzzle almost overnight. That is exactly why, even in the middle of a disaster, this serious business news outlets on the other side of the planet were also watching Kumamoto closely, worried less about the human cost for a moment and more about whether their next phone or laptop might ship a few weeks late. It is an uncomfortable contrast, but it is a real one, and it says something about how connected the modern world has become. A crack in the ground in one small Japanese town can end up on a stock market ticker in New York within hours. It is a strange but very real example of how one earthquake in one small region can eventually touch the price of things thousands of miles away. And yet, in the middle of all that, there were also small signs of the kind of resilience this region has clearly built up the hard way. Neighbors who barely knew each other before were sharing water and phone chargers outside their damaged homes. Volunteers showed up at shelters with food before officials had even finished setting up the cots. Local shop owners who could not open for business handed out bottled drinks to tired rescue crews walking past. None of that undoes the loss this disaster has caused, and it should not be used to paper over how serious it still is. But it is worth noticing because it is real too, happening in the same streets as everything else you just heard about. As of right now, the story is still moving. Rescue crews are still out there today. The death toll is still not final. Aftershocks are still being felt in the region, and officials are still telling residents to stay alert. This is not one of those disasters with a neat, finished ending yet. It is still happening to real people right now while you are watching this. What this disaster leaves us with, more than anything, is a genuinely strange and sobering lesson. An earthquake does not just knock things over. Sometimes its real damage hides itself for minutes or hours, quietly cracking a gas line inside a building that looked perfectly fine from the outside, waiting to become a second disaster all its own. The ground moved for less than a minute that Tuesday afternoon. The consequences of that minute are still unfolding days later, and they will keep unfolding for a long time to come in hospital rooms, in shelters, in factories deciding when it is safe to start the machines again, and in a castle that will now take even longer than 40 years to fully repair. It is easy to watch a story like this from far away and feel like it is just a headline, a number on a screen that goes up every few hours. But behind every single one of those numbers is someone who is just living a completely normal Tuesday. Someone pushing a shopping cart. Someone finishing a shift at a paper factory. Someone sitting at a nursing home desk. None of them expected the ground itself to turn against them that afternoon, and none of them had any warning beyond a few seconds, if they were lucky enough to get even that. If this story hit you the way it hit me while researching it, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of coverage reach more people who might not otherwise hear about it. Subscribe if you want to keep following stories like this one, told straight without the fluff. And turn on notifications because I will be posting an update the moment investigators confirm exactly what triggered that mall explosion. Before you go, here's a question for the comments. If a hidden gas leak inside one damaged wall could do that much damage on its own, what do you think that says about the buildings all around you right now? Let me know what you think down below. And if you want to understand how Japan's early warning system manages to give people a few precious seconds of notice before the real shaking even starts, I have got another video breaking that down completely. Go check it out next.